it'll announce it. And I want to thank everyone for coming today. And a special shout out to Vilvi Vanek and the Care and Shared Time Bank for organizing their in-person Zoom watch party at the UU Church this evening. I'm delighted that John de Graaf agreed to join us. Many of us are familiar with this classic film, Affluenza, a new word to describe the new disease of affluence spreading like affluenza throughout America, and his follow-up film, Escape from Affluenza. There is an escape. I think we know it. We're the escapees. John was one of the first people to address the problem of consumerism and the materialistic values that continue to plague what is now global consumer culture. A few of you might remember John de Graaf when he came to Columbus way back in 2006 and made two presentations here, one on the Motherhood Manifesto with momsrising.org and another talk on what's the economy for anyway. And let's see if I got, okay. Well, and Marilyn has already been the one who's here and remembers. Like those of us, and I have to say that I was still doing the updates back in 2006, and I simply did a search on my endless Google storage to find in 2006 the update that I did then, and talked about those presentations that John did. Like those of us in our Simply Living community, John's films and books explored new issues raised by consumerism. Examples include his early understanding that our economy is focused on growth, with 70% of our economy dependent upon consumer goods and services. Such an economy is simply not sustainable. John's Take Back Your Time book and film, and his talks on happiness, and the most recent film on Stuart Udall and the politics of beauty illustrate further the breadth of his work and messaging. I spoke with John yesterday, and he filled me in on his work with the Alliance for Happiness. I invite you to check out happycounts.org to learn more about that initiative. I put the URL in the chat if you want to check it out. First, I will ask John to talk about his own evolution and critiques of consumerism and their continued relevance today. We will open up for questions after that, and the floor is yours, John.
Well, okay, thank you. You know, I've been concerned about this issue since I was in my early 20s, I think. So long time. I really felt that this was the time in which the book Limits to Growth came out, so 1970, and it was certainly one that affected me strongly. There were others about how the problems with growth and with too much stuff, essentially. And so I wrote about that and talked about that in the early 1970s. In particular, I was living at that time in Minnesota. And, you know, then I got into filmmaking, actually doing films about historical subjects, particularly labor history. And in fact, two of the first three films that I ever made are going to be shown again. I haven't seen them for decades, but they're going to be shown again. They're bringing me to Minnesota June 22nd and 23rd for the 100th anniversary of the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota to show a couple of films that I made there in 1977 and 1980. So it's way back. And so I got into filmmaking and was not so much of an activist for quite a long time until doing the film Affluenza. I mean, I was doing films on a lot of environmental subjects, in particular, alternative agriculture, things of that sort. And then I did a film on overwork, which was called Running Out of Time, that was funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. It was funded by several different organizations and primarily actually PBS and for PBS. And then when that film premiered at the University of Washington in 1994, Vicki Robin was in the audience, and she came up to me and literally grabbed me by the shoulders and said, "John, you need to make a film about overconsumption." and I can help you find the money. And I said, Vicky, you just said the magic words. Why don't you, because the hardest thing in filmmaking is finding the money. So Vicky came down to Seattle PBS station. We talked about it, and she connected me with the Pew Charitable Trust, with a woman named Susan Seckler, who for a very short period, the Pew Charitable Trust was really interested in overconsumption. And so they funded the film Affluenza. And I think because the film was funny and not a scold in a sense, but that it had a little sugar to make the medicine go down. It was my most successful film. It had 4 9 o'clock weekday broadcasts on PBS nationally, so it had a lot of viewers, and then got out a lot into schools and colleges and universities. And then, since when you have a success, you have to make a sequel. I made the sequel called, Escape from Affluenza, which was more about simple living and those things, but to be quite honest, wasn't nearly as successful. People kind of liked the harder hitting, criticism of consumerism. But it did okay, it did fine. And so from that, Vicky, at that period, people like Cecile Andrews was working on Simple Living Circles, and Vicki Robin was working on Your Money or Your Life. We were all in Seattle. So Vicky decided to start this group called the Simplicity Forum, which was really about, bringing together some of the people from around the country who were writing and doing things with regard to this. And I think that must have started around the year 2000. My memory's a bit hazy. And that led to a group of us in that there. We had a meeting in Michigan we're at Kalamazoo, Michigan. And we decided to try to do something about the whole issue. And we decided if we just took it on again and said, scolding people, you're consuming too much, you're bad, you're destroying the environment, that wasn't going to get us real far. So we decided what we wanted to do was show people what it was that they were missing out on because of the emphasis on consumer culture. And the one thing we kind of all agreed on was that nobody had any time. Everybody was kind of working themselves to death or consuming so much and everything that they didn't have time for relationships. They didn't have time for nature. They didn't have time for these things. And besides, we Americans were just working longer hours than anybody else, certainly in the rich world. And so we started this organization called Take Back Your Time. In 2002, we had our first Take Back Your Time Day in 2003, and that was a huge success. We had events in about 200 cities around the United States, and we got 500 separate bits of media attention from everything from the New York Times and USA Today to all kinds of little stations and so forth. And that movement grew and was doing pretty well for a while. Then came 2008. The economy collapsed, as you all know, and nobody cared about whether they had to work too much. They just wanted to work at all, So we suddenly had no money. Nobody would fund us, and I had to start looking for some other way. I also had the book Affluenza out, and so I was again doing a lot of talks on these subjects on time and on that. And then I got into in 2010, I believe it was. I was invited to speak about overwork at a happiness conference in Canada, and the folks who were there, who were kind of running things, were all from Bhutan, this little country in Asia that was aiming for gross national happiness instead of gross national product. And so I met some of these Bhutanese and got involved in this kind of world international happiness movement. We had a big meeting at the United Nations in 2011, and then I was invited by the Prime Minister of Bhutan to come to Bhutan as an advisor to the government on this gross national happiness campaign. And we started this group called the Happiness Alliance, which is still running. That's Happy Counts. And started surveying people and doing other things. And I went to Bhutan, had an amazing time. And we worked on this for a bit, and my colleague has kept that work up wonderfully. Her name is Laura Musikansky. But I always kind of tend to move on a little bit. And so after some time on that, um, I was really worried. In 2017, I had never been quite so worried because Trump had been elected, and I felt like the country was imploding or exploding or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, the polarization was becoming outrageous, and that we needed to do something that would bring people together. We needed to find a place where we could reach common ground on some things. And I felt, and I had done a lot of reading on this subject, I felt that that place was actually things that people had in common was that everybody, conservatives and liberals, all like their parks, their national parks. They like their gardens. They like creating and experiencing natural beauty, and also wherever you go, they like built beauty. You know, particularly if you go to any of the great old cities of Europe, people flock to them because that matters. So I then started a campaign called "And Beauty for All," and that's still going, although it's kind of petering along. But because of that, I got very interested. Well, it was 2020, right at the start of COVID. I read an article that said that one of these 100 years ago today articles, I'm coming to the end here, but 100 years ago today, Stuart Udall was born. And I thought, wow, Stuart Udall, I know who that guy, you know, I met that guy. I interviewed him in 1988 for a film about the environmentalist David Brower. And I just thought he was such an amazing person, so humble, so smart, but he's dead, you know. So, but I thought somebody should do a film about this guy because he really should be honored. And so I started asking around if anything had been done. Nothing had been done. Began connecting to his kids and to his family, and they were very interested in the whole idea. And then started fundraising and started doing some shooting. And so it was a 2-year project. We did it all through COVID. We were out when everybody, I guess, was mostly quarantining and things like that. Probably, I don't know if we should have done it, but we didn't get anything. And we went to various places: New England, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, in particularly in the summer of 21. And we're, you know, shot this film and then put it together in 2022, and it came out in the fall of 2022. And since that time, we've done at least 100 screenings of this film in 24 states and 5 countries. I was just invited in January to screen the film at the Sorbonne in Paris and give a speech, a keynote address to an EU conference about the subject of the politics of beauty and how beauty can bring us together in many ways. And also what our studies are starting to show now through the Happiness Alliance, we're actually measuring what it means to people. One of the things that we found, we know that social connection and health and all these things are hugely important for happiness. We didn't know how important beauty was. Now we're starting to find that out. We're starting to find that people who are in a community that they think is not unattractive, is an ugly community, is vandalized, is graffiti filled, is all those things, are 20% less satisfied with their lives as a matter of course than people who live in a community that they think is an attractive place to live, with parks and nature and green space and all of those things. So that's an enormous difference. That's 20 points. It's just a big difference. And the Brits are doing the same thing. So they have a big project in England where they're measuring this, and they're getting exactly the same data. 20% seems to be the figure. So then we need a politics of beauty to talk about the things that we can do, to use that to bring people together. And then if people come together around an issue like that they agree on and start to get to know each other, then maybe they can talk about some of the harder issues that we face as a country. So my new film, now we've shown this film, as I said, at 24 states, 5 countries, soon to be on probably a public TV station near you. But my new film is the same theme. It's called Loyal to the Truth, and it's the story of the hidden story behind the song America the Beautiful. America the Beautiful is a song that people love across the political spectrum. But nobody on either side really actually gets the song, which is not this patriotic anthem, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually a song that's very critical of the United States. It has lines in it like, America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control. And this was about the imperialism of the Spanish-American War. America, America, may God thy gold refine till selfish gain no longer stains the banner of the free. So this song was written by a woman, a professor, an activist, suffragist, feminist, social reformer. And it was a song that really illustrated those times of the Gilded Age in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And it speaks to, I think, America because everyone loves it. It should be our national anthem. Ray Charles spent 6 years trying to make it our national anthem. So this film is what I'm working on now, and all my time is consumed both fundraising for this, and I'm going to Massachusetts next week to do a lot of research at Wellesley College, where Catherine Lee Bates taught for 40 years, and in Falmouth, Massachusetts, where she grew up. And then we'll be going to Colorado because she actually wrote that song on top of Pikes Peak. Anyway, enough. This is the evolution of my thinking.
That's wonderful, John. I really appreciate it. As far as I think it would be best if someone, if you have a question, put it in the chat. If you're on screen, let's see if let me switch it back the view to gallery. Put that back. So if you have a question, you can just raise your hand. I'm on a weird situation here in my basement. And feel free to ask your question. I have a question to start things off. I really appreciate the evolution, John, and I wanted to and the continuing relevance of all these themes today, from Take Back Your Time, the happiness, the opportunities for taking back your time from the consumer culture. Shows really is that these are the benefits of paying attention to what we can do without the consumer culture. Anyway, my question was your thoughts on the connection between consumerism and climate change.
Well, I think that's a fairly clear one. You know, what propels our consumer society is not only the exhaustion of all kinds of mineral resources and everything else, but fossil fuel. You know, this society we could never produce the kind of things that we do and expect the kind of lives filled with speed and travel and stuff without fossil fuels. So in demanding more and more of that, all of that stuff, we often think that, oh, the carbon emissions are, you know, when you drive your car or something like that. But the city of Portland, Oregon, for example, did a study and found that something like 60% of the carbon cost of their lifestyle was embedded in the products that they consumed. And that at least 40+% of that came from other countries. And so we have tended to blame, you know, China. Oh, China is now the biggest polluter, the most greenhouse gases and stuff. But who's buying that stuff? And we somehow get off it from that because the emissions aren't coming directly from us. But Portland found that something like 40% of the carbon that really went into making their lifestyle was embedded in products. Only maybe 25 to 30% of carbon actually came from their heating and their transportation and the other kinds of things that we tend to focus on. So consumerism does obviously have a big impact on that.
I totally agree. I quote the Rocky Mountain Institute as having a very similar, maybe that's the same study. They kind of deconstructed from mining to production, you know, manufacturing, production, distribution, throwaway. So it's really, people don't think about every time you buy a thing, pull something off the shelf at Target or Walmart or wherever, 42% of that greater contextual understanding of that product is CO2 embedded. Okay, so I see Randy has his hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Chuck. John, what came to my mind was, it's easy for us, as you said earlier, to see all the negative impacts we have and what's going on in various cultures that do impact our lives in so many negative ways. But you've also been largely in touch with a lot of positive change, and I wondered, to help build our hope and inspire us, is there something on the macro level, the large level, that you see going on that could inspire us, that some of the work that we've done on a local level, state level, has made some level of impact?
Well, I think so. It's hard to get too positive, in the sense that we're still seeing the numbers going up for greenhouse gas pollution. We're still seeing the impacts of climate change. But I think it would be a lot worse, actually, if we hadn't done the things that were done, and we don't take enough credit for that. I mean, we have to look at, if we hadn't slowed this to some degree with the kind of things that we do, I think we would be seeing things a lot worse. It doesn't mean we don't have to continue doing it, but it's why I've tried to figure out what are some of the ways that you can ease this in, to talk to people about it and to get them to think differently about some of these things. So when I think of, for example, the impact of beauty on these things, one thing we know is that people who live in a beautiful environment, who have parks available and green space and things, have less need for stimulating themselves, and are being more likely to be out taking care of their health, and being, doing, they're not as likely to consume as much if that stuff is local. Now, if they have to travel long distances to get to any kinds of parks or green space or anything that's beautiful, that's a different story, because that takes energy. The city of Vienna, Austria, is a good example of the impact that beauty has on climate change and on all of these things. So a friend of mine used to be the transportation director of the city of Vienna. He's a transportation engineer. And he said, he's a very funny guy. His name is Herman Noflacher, and he's very Austrian. And he said I had given a talk about beauty in Hungary that he was at, and he came up to me afterwards. He says, John, we know that beauty has things that can make us live better, and it's good for the environment and stuff. But we know that instinctively, but the bureaucrats, they have to have the data. We have to show them the data of how this works. And then he said, and I have the data, and I will give you the data. And so he sat me down, and he told me about how the fact that they, for instance, next to busy streets and stuff, put walkways with trees and things that people could walk along, how they put in more parks and more green spaces, how they put in art in the metro stations in Vienna and stuff. The result of this was that people were willing to walk far more before they got into their car. They were more willing to take public transportation, to bicycle, to do all these kinds of things. And not only did they see something like a 24% decrease in automobile use and such from this, they also saw that people were less stressed and healthier and happier as a result. So they would ask people questions in different places in the city, essentially on a scale of 1 to 10, how happy do you feel right now, which is the standard way we measure that stuff. And they found basically the same kind of thing. If people were in one of these pretty locations, about 20% higher sense of how well they felt about how they were doing and so forth, than if they were, out by a busy street. Also, they found that buildings mattered. So if you were walking in these steel glass towers, these huge monolithic towers, people expressed much less satisfaction And if they were walking in the old parts of town with old buildings and narrow streets and places where it was kind of, there was an interest in it itself. But they didn't stop with asking people how happy they were. They took their blood. And when they took their blood, what they found is that the levels of cortisol were much, much higher in these places where a lot of traffic, a lot of huge buildings, less green, and all of that kind of stuff. And cortisol, the amounts of cortisol are a sign of stress. And they have, when you get too much of it, it has a big effect. So there was more than that, but that's one of the things that Vienna found as a city. And if you go to Vienna, Vienna is now rated the best life satisfaction of any city in the world.
Wow. Kathy, you're next, I think.
Hey, yeah, all of this about parks and political polarization caught my attention because about a year ago I helped launch an organization called Save Ohio Parks, because in December of 2022, our Ohio State Legislature, which is highly, highly gerrymandered, took it upon themselves to stuff a bill about poultry chicks with oil and gas amendments that said gas is green, and we're mandating fracking on our public lands, including our state parks. And that has been around. There was a bill in 2011 that opened up the state parks for fracking, but there was such a public outcry that the governors after that never filled the commission that was supposed to oversee that. Well, once this was passed in late 2022, that commission was named and began to operate, and they began taking oil and gas nominations. And Save Ohio Parks has been working very hard this whole past year and into the future to try to stop this. We haven't totally been successful, but we've had a lot of support and a lot of people wanting to help. I don't know if we're going to be able to pull this off, but we're talking about a ballot initiative. But I guess I just wanted to get your comments on, if, like, we're in an oil and gas state, we're in a fracking state, and they control the government here. And so it's directly, like they went after Salt Fork, which is the largest state park, like one of the gems of Eastern Ohio. They've gone after several wildlife areas, and it's continuing. So I guess.
Yeah, no, that's, well, I don't know about, your case. It seems like a terrible case. I mean, because clearly we know the value of green spaces and parks and things like that. Gallup did a study called the Soul of the Community study from 2010 to, I think, 2014. And Gallup discovered that having parks and green spaces and natural beauty in a city also resulted in, it was one of the three top factors in whether that city would be a place that people wanted to stay in, live in, continue to, or whether they wanted to go somewhere else. The other two were social connection and actually how welcoming the community was of new people who came in. Now, there were 26 cities in this study. They ranged in size from Philadelphia of 2 million people to Aberdeen, South Dakota with 20,000 people. And in all 26 out of 10 categories that Gallup looked at, which include public safety, it included the economy, it included the schools, these three were the top three in every single city. So Gallup concluded that, having beauty and having parks and having green space matters so much to people. And so I think to promote that, Frank Luntz, you probably heard that name. Frank Luntz is a GOP pollster. He was certainly George Bush's pollster. He's also a very smart guy. And one of the things that Frank Luntz did in 2000 or 2002, he was asked to look at and advise George Bush about, what Republicans should do and what they shouldn't do. And he said, well, what you really shouldn't do is attack parks. He said, because your constituents like the parks just as much as the Democrats do. It is a losing thing. And, you need to be on the side of parks and greenery. Secondly, there's now a movement in the United States, which you may have heard of, called Parks RX, Has anybody heard of that? RX being the health. So Parks RX started in the Children's Hospital in Oakland, California, by a doctor who's from Iran. Actually, I forget her name, but anyway, she discovered that um, all these stressed out poor kids in the ghetto of Oakland and other places, one of the things that really could change them and make them healthier and lose the stress was time spent out in parks, in greenery. And so she started beginning to actually write prescriptions to these parents of these kids saying, I'm not going to give you a pill. The prescription is you have to take your kid to the park for X hours this week. And it became known as the Parks RX or Parks Health movement. Now around the country, they found that it had an enormous effect on these kids, a calming effect, less violence. The other really interesting study is a study done in Philadelphia, which shows the value of really just cleaning up bad areas and planting either gardens or greenery or trees or stuff. You can look this up from the New York Times. It says, to stop gun violence, clean up the neighborhood. I think that's the title of it. It's a study done by the University of Pennsylvania. And what they found was that if you took vacant lots that were full of garbage and litter and graffiti and stuff, and you clean those things up, and then you started planting things and making them green and in various ways and use them for urban gardens. And if you did the same thing with abandoned homes, which were being vandalized and graffiti covered, the impact of doing that, and they did 1,400 studies, 1,400 separate interventions along these lines, and they discovered that this led to a drop in the homicide rate of 30%, a drop in the overall crime rate of something like 28%, a drop in the reported mental illness of 58%, 60% more people said they were not fearful to go out into their community. And the study found that for every dollar invested in these kinds of cleanups and greening of places, the city of Philadelphia saved $70 in the costs of dealing with the problems caused by the communities that were full of junk, basically. And so these are findings that I think, who's going to argue about that? What conservative is going to say we wouldn't rather save the $70? I mean, the 70 tax dollars get saved for one that's invested. That's a pretty good thing. I don't think even anybody on the right is going to argue with that. So I think we have to look at these things and lay out this kind of the data, as Herman said, and show both the representatives, but also in various kinds of ways, if we can, the public, that these things matter. And if you go anywhere, there are people who will tell you that beauty is purely subjective. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Nothing is more false. Probably the most universal instinct that we share through evolution is our appreciation, particularly of natural beauty. And I could go into all the studies that show this, but our sense of what's beautiful is remarkably universal in terms of the natural world and all of these things. In England, they find, for instance, they use photographs of different places, and they ask people to rate them from 1 to 5 about beautiful, or 1 to 10, beautiful, not beautiful, and so forth. And they find that there's way over 90% agreement on how people feel about these places. And then they have all these places set up, and they have these little apps called mappings. And you get a little app, and wherever you are, every so often you get a little buzz on your app. And then you need to put in then how happy you feel on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being highest. They find the same thing. They know where you are because it's all geoconnected. And that if you're in one of these places that's highly rated, your results are 20% on average, higher life satisfaction. So we're seeing this. And if you go, I can tell you this, if you go to any national park, Now you're going to see a lot of cultural mix. And if you go to Yosemite, for example, which is my favorite place in the world, um, you know, it is not a place with all white folks anymore, and hasn't been for a long time. The number of Asian tourists, the number of Hispanics from California, even increasingly, although fewer, the number of African Americans, it's really on the increase. And the same thing is true. You can go to Zermatt in Switzerland, and most of the people you'll see are from Asia. So there is this idea that all of this is so different and that you can't do these things because beauty is purely subjective. It's just nonsense. It doesn't hold up when you actually look at the data.
That's
I
very
went
good
on
to
too
hear.
long.
That's wonderful.
I know I'm outrageous, but this is what the French brought me to the Sorbonne to talk about. So, and the French, I think, like this sort of thing.
Well, we like it too. And Vilvi, I see you have your hand up, and I was just going to say, if anyone in your watch party wants to ask a question, just come up closer to the microphone as you are.
I had a quick question. For anyone who knows me, it's probably the obvious question. I was wondering if you would like to give an opinion. I was thinking about what you said about how it comes down to time a lot. That's what we tend to be losing. And I tend to think that the time bank is the perfect solution for how to get back your time. But what are your thoughts on a time bank? Do you think that they're anything? What do you think about them?
Well, I mean, I think people who are involved in them like them, and they're a useful thing. They haven't been a focus of mine, but I'm certainly not. I have no problem with them. I think that they are a good idea. My focus has been more on legislation, on things like how do we give people more of a legal vacation time, because America has the least vacation time of any. We don't get any by law. Every country in Europe, for example, gets 4 weeks of vacation time by law. Their works weeks are shorter. They get family leave. They get sick leave. They get all these kind of things, and we Americans don't have this sort of stuff. But it is starting to change. If there's any benefit to COVID, it's that it started to make us rethink work time. And we're seeing that in various places. The whole idea that people now actually could work 4 days a week and be plenty productive. In fact, in my humble opinion, too productive, because we still produce way more stuff than we need. But nonetheless, it's easy, and companies that are experimenting with this in various places in the world are finding that it works for them. Workers can, and if it works for 3 days off a week, it can work for 4. So I think pushing those kinds of things is essential. Now, I have no opposition to time banks or anything like that. I think that being able to barter and trade and share these things with each other is a nice substitute for cash in that regard. But it just hasn't been where the focus of my efforts have been.
And in response to Vilvi, I will say that Simply Living, who is an affiliate member of the Time Bank, the sharing goes across the internet. In fact, 2 of our recent volunteers for Simply Living with our calendar and helping with the newsletter live in Silver Spring, Maryland, and they happen to know each other, but the work is online. So that's an interesting way to look at it. And they get credit, and they actually volunteer in order to get the credits that we offer through our time bank that they can use on theirs. So interesting.
Yeah, no, I think those are good things. I'm certainly, basically, I'm a case study in everything I criticize when it comes to time, because I don't think I'm supposed to be retired. I'm 77 years old, but I don't think I've ever been busier in my entire life. So like I said, I'm a case study in everything I criticize. I started an organization. I joked about this during the Take Back Your Time movement that I was starting a new organization called AHA, AHA, the American Hypocrites Association. And I would be the first member, and you're all welcome to join me.
I'm with you. I'm a simple liver living in a 4-bedroom suburban house. So I could say more. I do have solar panels.
But I was always good about that part of it. I'm not a consumer, so I live in a small place. I
Yeah.
don't have a lot of goods. That part of it I'm good at. The time part of it, the taking time and doing all that, better not look to me for advice, because I'm not good at that at all.
Understood. Eugene, did you have your hand up earlier? I thought
Well, I do have something to mention. John, maybe you could talk a little bit about getting nature back. One of my favorite pastimes is to cycle the rail trail opportunities we have in Ohio, like the Cuyahoga Valley Trail, goes along the towpath of the canal, the old canal routes, So repurposing things like rails that are not used anymore, rebuilding these towpaths for paving and speeding along on a bicycle or walking or hiking. What other ways can we bring nature back into our urban environment?
Well, that's a great one. I'm a big fan of rails to trails. And I did one film about a conversion to a wonderful hiking trail of a railroad in Washington State, Stevens Pass. It's forgetting the name of the trail right now, but it'll come to me. So anyway, I'm a big believer in that. I am now, unfortunately, I have issues with my legs and feet from edema and other things. So my ability to do some of those things is very limited compared to what it used to be. But I think it's a terrific thing. And when I used to, it was called the Iron Goat Trail. I made a film about, and it over Stevens Pass, which is the trains went over. It's 4,000 feet in Washington State. They went by this old route first, and then they created a new route that was less steep for the trains. And so there was these long tunnels and all this other stuff that the trains were no longer, they don't take anymore. And so those were converted into a big trail called the Iron Goat Trail. The Iron Goat was the railroad, named for the railroad in the old days. And it's just a wonderful trail for people for seeing the scenery. And I know that those kinds of things I get the magazine of the Rails to Trails folks. So it's a great one. And it is also one that I think does cross the political spectrum.
Yeah, I know in some other countries they're building residential high rises with vertical gardens. Are they doing that in this country at all?
I'm sure there's some of it. It's not something I have much expertise about. I've certainly heard about it, but it's not something I have a lot of knowledge about. And I don't like to go on about things I don't know about. So I'll just take it from me that that's where my ignorance really shows.
you have quite a fund of knowledge, John. Kevin Eigel.
So I just want to say thank you, John, for joining us today. And your work is really wonderful. My wife and I were just watching the film on Stuart Udall. It was really inspiring. My wife wanted to make sure that I told you that she brought tears to her eyes. She was crying just watching it.
That does happen. It's funny. I had Gary Nabhan, who's in the film, who's a wonderful guy. He's a naturalist, famous naturalist. And when we had a screening in Arizona that he was at, he said, when I got involved in this, I didn't think this film was going to make me cry, So, but I think Stuart Udall was such an inspiring person. He just was represented, I think, everything that person should be, and especially that a public figure should be. I think that's what makes him so unique. There are a lot of saints out there, personal saints, people like you in your communities and stuff, but very few of them get to be Secretary of Interior or a U.S. Congressperson and stuff, and don't lose that what they have. But Stewart is one that really kept that idealism throughout his life and that humility. He told me, so he was at one point in favor of the damming the Grand Canyon. This was, believe it or not, most of the country wanted to dam the Grand Canyon in the 1960s. It was a big deal because they were going to, and especially the Southwest wanted it because they wanted to use it to pump the water and to make the desert bloom and all of these things. And so Stewart, initially being a congressman before that from Arizona, and an Arizona guy, was convinced that, you had to do this kind of thing. So he got into an argument with the famous environmentalist David Brower, who I made a film about, who built the Sierra Club. And David was able to eventually convince Stewart that this was the wrong thing to do. Stewart was getting things from both sides, and he said, well, I'm going to let the river tell me. And so he took a raft with his kids down the river, and he came out of that and said there will be no dams in the Grand Canyon. And now that just seems like common sense. But the fact is, that was the end of Stewart Udall's career. He couldn't run for dog catcher in Arizona after doing that, and everybody thought he would be the next governor or senator from that state. And what Stewart Udall said to me was, I thank David Brower for showing me I was wrong, for showing me the light on this kind of thing. I am forever in his debt. Yeah. This sort of saying, I'm in his debt because he put me out of work, because he made it impossible for me to do some of the things you just don't hear that kind of thing from political figures, but that's who Stewart was. And I think that's who his kids are, especially his son, Tom, who is now was a U.S. Senator from New Mexico, almost our Interior Secretary, but I think everybody was glad that Deb Haaland was picked so that we would have a Native American Interior Secretary. Tom is now the ambassador to New Zealand, and just amazing guys. That whole family is so inspiring. Sorry, I went on too long.
Thank you for your work. Very inspiring. I know your book Affluenza had a big impact on me too back when it came out. I like to just to hear, interesting to hear your thoughts about where you are now with focus on happiness as a way of bringing people together, and what you're just saying about bringing nature back into our lives. I'm always just asking myself, what can I do that really is going to make a difference, have an impact? It's hard to really know, but I do like being close to nature. I know that. My life.
Well, I think some of these things, fighting for the parks, fighting for making the neighborhoods more attractive is one thing. And I think they can also reduce consumerism. I also think that working less can reduce consumerism because they have less money to spend on all the stuff. And I think as we do other things, we have less need of that. We also know that if people are more educated, if they have more broad interests that are intellectual interests, they're less likely to fill up the emptiness with stuff. So supporting good education, and education that isn't just about careers, it isn't just about to get a job, get the good education. It's education for life, education for being fascinated and curious about the world and all the things that are out there. And that can really take us away from the emphasis on consumerism, I think. It's not easy. I'm not pretending that this is easy. And the happiness issue, I think, is still an important one. And the Happy Council is still a great organization, still doing really good work. But it is true, like everything else, that to some degree, the happiness movement was hijacked by consumerism and by corporations, and by that, so that the tips more and more became, it's just all about what you do personally, and not about what we do as a society. It's just your happiness at work, and you'll be a better employee and more productive at work for your company if you're happy. Well, that's true, but that's not the reason that we want you to be happy. And our happiness as isolated individuals doesn't count for much if we haven't done something to share that. And Stuart, was just a great believer in public service. And we've had, we're this group. I don't know all of you, of course, but I think obviously where the world is concerned, and even maybe in our own, we're relatively privileged people, and so, uh, we can do things that also try to make it possible for other people to have that. Now, in that, I will send a word of warning that some of you may disagree with, but in that, I think we've actually gone way overboard in, I would say, sort of extreme identity politics in this country. And I think that is actually one of the things that's making it harder to bring people together for all of these things. I think we have to stop thinking in terms of everybody being the oppressed and the oppressor, and the bad and the good, and all of those kind of things. I think, what happened to George Floyd was horrible. Yeah, and what the racism in America is horrible. But I think we went so far in the response to that, in everything, that we're actually further dividing people rather than bringing us together. And it's something I've certainly seen in Seattle, and you may have seen it where you live as well. So I worry that we can sometimes take a good thing too far, and it can boomerang on us.
No, Marilyn has a question here. So
Yeah, Marilyn, the founder of Simply Living, you're up.
Oh, I just want to second Kevin's appreciation, John. I think your recounting of these movies, your trajectory of choosing topics always with an eye to what will bring us higher quality of life, greater awareness of our place in the world, and what does it mean to be a change agent? You have lived the life of being a change agent in ways that are really so admirable. And I'm delighted to hear at 77, you're still on it.
I told you, I sometimes wish I wasn't so busy.
Right.
But on the other hand, I know that in one way it makes me older, and another way it keeps me younger. So, the two will just keep fighting each other.
So, creative tension. That's
right.
another mantra, right?
That's right. No, mentally it's great for me. Physically, I'm not so sure. And anyway, from my side, thank you. It's great to see a group like this. I haven't been to Columbus in a long, long time, but the one thing I've always known about Columbus, Ohio, is it was the home of my favorite 1960s folk singer, Phil Oakes. And and I just so it was just this month was the 50th anniversary of Phil Oakes' death, which of course hit me very hard when it happened. He ended up hanging himself. But there are several of Phil Oakes' songs in my film about Stuart Udall, because Phil Oakes, on the one hand, really celebrated the beauty of America. His early songs were things like "The Power and the Glory," this is a land full of beauty that words cannot recall. He had this young innocence and stuff, and unfortunately, a lot of that, of course, was destroyed by what happened with the Vietnam War and Chicago and these things. But that was always there, and the other songs of Phil's that are in the movie are about Vietnam, because Vietnam was a big issue for Stuart Udall as well, and he was against the war, but he knew that if he spoke out publicly, President Johnson would immediately fire him, and he would be ineffective to do the things. And so he had to struggle with that, as we all have to do. His own family, was encouraging him simply to quit, and go public. And his brother Mo was the first member of the U.S. Congress, of the House of Representatives, to speak publicly against the Vietnam War. But Stuart decided to stay with what he was doing, to finish the environmental work, and then speak out against the war, which he did certainly after that. And on balance, I think he made the right decision, because he was able to accomplish an awful lot. But people think that, you know, I think a lot of young people now think that, oh, you just got to do the principle no matter what, you just do this, you know. And I think politics is different. I think you really do have to consider what the unforeseen consequences are of the decisions. One of the things that made me most happy about this film is an email that I got from someone who watched the film, whose name happens to be Craig McNamara. And the name McNamara may ring a bell with a few of you folks because Craig's dad was the architect of the Vietnam War as the Secretary of Defense. He was in the same cabinet as Stuart Udall, and McNamara and Udall were friends, and their families were friends. They went hiking together. And Craig told me, and Craig was a 15-year-old at the time, opposed to the war that his dad was conducting. And he said, you know, I always loved Stu Udall and the family, but I never even knew that Stu was against the war because my dad didn't talk about that. He kept family and politics separate. And he said, you know, knowing that Stuart was in there in the cabinet fighting my dad and arguing with him and things like that makes Stuart even more, you know, a neat guy for me. And he's finished the email by saying, you know, what I came away from watching your film was that this world would be a far better place if my dad had listened to Stuart Udall.
Oh, wonderful.
And Craig is currently an organic walnut farmer in California.
Fascinating. I could hear these stories forever. I see in the chat that Rita Hayter puts a note that Simply Living shares the monthly happiness calendar from the Greater Good Science Center at University of California, Berkeley. And
good organization.
Yeah, and it's fun to read each month, a new one coming up soon. And we thank Rita for sharing that with us. She discovered that. The happiness and the beauty connections are awesome. I know it's a little bit over time, but I will just say, as a person who was back in the 80s, was doing a doctoral program in art education at Ohio State. And there's a lot of research in art ed that would definitely reinforce or confirm many of the observations you made, John. The anecdote that always sticks in my brain is that, you know, the point that really everybody has an aesthetic sense. And if you doubt that, you can go over to the materialist side and you can see the young woman of the 80s touching up her bouffant hairdo very carefully. We all have a sense of beauty. And I love that work, and I look forward to exploring more in the happycounts.org website, which I just looked at today. And
it's a great organization. I don't work directly with it anymore. Laura and I started that organization together in 2011, I believe, and so it's 2010. So she's been going almost, you know, about 14 years on that, and I was involved for quite some time. And then I think that if I had grown up now, I would have been in school immediately diagnosed as having ADHD and given Ritalin and sent out to pasture. And but I am kind of ADHD, I have to admit, and I do kind of go a bit from thing to thing. And if I feel like something isn't quite, then I, you know, and it's not just the next new thing or anything like that. It's not that I don't stick with it, but I try to be serious about can this make a difference. So Laura has stuck with this, and I again, you know, I do these kind of things, and then I pass them on to other people, and they carry on the good work.
Absolutely, and so much good work. And I want to thank again, John, for joining us. I could listen to anecdotes like the people you've worked with and known, and the stories, the Vietnam War.
I'll tell you one final one before you go. So think about this when you get one of those things on your phone that says spam alert. You've probably seen that, right?
Yes.
Have you seen that? Things that come up sometimes on your phone? Well, I never answer those things, but I was in New Mexico a couple of years back, and actually in a motel room, and phone rang, and I got this thing, and it said spam alert, and there was this little voice in my head that said, just answer this. I don't know why, because I don't normally do it. So I answered it. And the woman says, well, hi, this is Devin Howe or Hall or something. She says, I am the assistant to Ambassador Tom Udall, calling you from New Zealand. And Ambassador Udall wanted me to call you. He would tell you himself, but he's in the middle of things, but he wanted me to call you to tell you that he just had a personal screening of your film for the ambassador to Australia, who happens to be Caroline Kennedy. And they knew each, and of course their fathers worked together. And she said, and they both of them had this wonderful experience of watching this film and talking about their childhoods and their dads and all of this. And Tom just wanted to make sure that you knew this. So sometimes even a spam alert isn't what it seems.
That's a great story and a good one to end on. And I thank again everybody for coming, and John for just remarkable insights and sharing of his life work. So,
thank you very much. It's my pleasure and my honor, and keep doing the good work.
thanks, John.